just realized I haven't been saying the author's names this whole time, but whatever. Hello and welcome to a new video. First off, I apologize, the lighting is not great. It is already 5:45, so the sun is starting to go down, so I don't have great natural lighting, but I wanted to film a video, so I had one to post this week. The one I am doing is something I've never done before. I think it'll be kind of fun. So as readers, I feel like we have all spoke to someone who, if we express our love for reading, there's someone who's like, oh, I hate reading, or I haven't read a book since high school, or I can't remember the last time I read a book, reading is boring, blah blah blah, that sort of stuff, which I hate those comments. I truly think, and I have all of my life thought, that if you do not love reading, it's just because you haven't found the right book. You haven't found a book that you just fall in love with and you're able to experience this magical world. So I put together a list of 10 books that I have read and loved that I think would translate well to people who say they don't like to read. These books are a variety of genres. I have a few contemporaries and some fantasy and a mystery, and it's mostly YA, but I do have an adult book on there as well. And if you have someone that you really want to get into reading, maybe suggest one of these books to them. I think really everyone can learn to love to read. So with that introduction done, let's get into my list of 10 books. So the first book I have, I think, is a really popular one, and I think it actually has got a lot of people into reading, and that is To All the Boys I Loved Before by Jenny Han. Now, this book is a young adult romance, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and I think the reason it is so approachable is because the main character is just so lovable, and the story is so entertaining, and it's just a really cute, fluffy romance book, and it's a series of 3 books, and you can really just fly through them so quickly. They're an easy read, and I think anyone of pretty much any age range, if they do like rom-com type stuff, they would love these books. A plus side to this one is that there is a movie adaptation as well, and 2 more movies coming out, so that's a really big selling point, I think, to people who don't like to read. Another one that I think is a go-to recommendation for me is the Percy Jackson series. Now, typically, because I've worked in bookstores for the last couple of years, I typically recommend this one to, you know, moms, aunts, someone who is looking for a book for their kid, and it's for a kid who says they hate reading, they don't want to read. I think Percy Jackson is a key book that can pull them into reading, especially boys sometimes, because Percy is, the main character is a boy, and a lot of young kids can relate to him, but I also think young girls can relate to him as well. I think this is the perfect recommendation for, you know, kids, young adults who aren't into reading yet. I think it pulls them in because it's a whole series of 5 books, and they just, you know, you want to devour them because they're so good. And as they learn to love to read, there are 5 more longer books that continue the story on, and then all the spin-off series as well. So I think this is a perfect one to get into the world of reading because there's just so much material. My next recommendation is for a bit of an older age group, and that is A Court of Thorns and Roses by J Maas. Now, to almost no fail, if someone came up to me in a bookstore or even a friend and asked me for a YA fantasy romance, or like just a romance book or just a fantasy book, or any of those little pieces, A Court of Thorns and Roses was a go-to recommendation for me. I think it is written in an approachable way for being a fantasy, and I just think it's so good, and like the romances in the book really pull you along in the story, and it's just so well written and so good, and I love it so much. And really, I can't even stress how many times I have recommended this book to people. I have bought it for people. I'm like, please read this, everyone. Read A Court of Thorns and Roses. And that's why I think it makes a really good recommendation for people who maybe are into reading, because it pulls you in whether you've ever read a big book or not. Next is an oldie but a goodie, and that is City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. This is another I have recommended countless times to customers and to friends, and that is because it is another big fantasy series, but because this one is grounded in reality, it takes place in our modern world, or in like 2012, which is close enough, and then just weaves in the magical elements. It's a good place to start in fantasy if you're someone who maybe only reads realistic fiction and wants to get into fantasy, or doesn't read much and wants to get into fantasy. I think it's a really good place to start because it is a good jumping off point into like the magical world. Plus, it's really good. The characters are young and relatable and make stupid decisions, but it is like so good to read. What's the word? I can't think of the word, but it's almost like a telenovela, you know, like that drama. It's really good, just drama and like ridiculous stuff like that, but in the greatest way possible. Next is my only adult book on the list, and that is A Discovery of Witches. I think that this book would make a really good recommendation for sort of older people who maybe aren't into reading, so like college age and older. If there are people who say they don't like to read and I think this is a good one because it's such a rich fantasy, but again, like City of Bones, is grounded in our real world. So you're able to recognize, you know, the real world setting and still get those elements of magic because Diana is a witch and Matthew is a vampire, and you get all these magical elements that are really cool. And with this one, there's also the plus side that it is a show as well, and it's an incredible show, by the way, like perfect, almost perfect adaptation to the book, which is a really exciting selling point for this series, I believe. So definitely recommend that one. Next was a recent read for me, but quite honestly one of my favorites of all time, and that is A Study in Charlotte by Brittany Cavallaro. A Study in Charlotte is an incredibly entertaining read because it is a mystery at its core. It just propels you through the plots so quickly and so energetically, and it's just such an incredible read. And I think it's a great pull for people who maybe aren't into reading, but maybe they like the Sherlock movies or the classic Sherlock show, or you know, the adaptation from BBC. If they like Sherlock, they like, you know, mystery shows, even if they like, you know, Criminal Minds, if they like mystery, I think this one is such a good recommendation because the mysteries are so interesting, and you've got the classic, you know, Sherlock versus Moriarty, which is so incredible. It just takes it and puts such an interesting twist on it, and I just absolutely adore it. And sort of like To All the Boys That Lived Before, I think this series is such a fast read, it's like so fast paced, it keeps you going, that it's just an incredible one to start off with. Next, I have another contemporary, and that is Autobiography by Christina Lauren. This one I would recommend to, I don't know, I think the youngest I would recommend this to is maybe 13, and that would depend on like what that 13-year-old is allowed to read. I have recommended this one quite a few times to people, and I only put a caveat on the age because there is one sex scene, there's one sex scene, I think. I think it's a really important book to read because it tackles a gay love story in a younger age group, and I think that's important to get. If you have like a younger teen or even an older teen who isn't into reading, this would be a good one to recommend to them because it exposes them to, you know, other types of life, and it's just such an incredible story. And I almost put Love, Simon in this part as well, which is another great recommendation. I just have a special place in my heart for autobiography. I really, really love it. But Love, Simon is another really good recommendation, sort of along those lines. Next is a high fantasy, but it is young adult, and that is Children of Blood and Bone. I think this one's a really good fantasy recommendation if you have someone you know who doesn't like to read, but if they like big fantasy stuff like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, like that sort of genre of television and movie, I think they would like Children of Blood and Bone because it's a really high fantasy, it's bloody, it's gory, it's got super exciting stuff, there are betrayals and all this like just crazy stuff happening alongside all of the like magical plotline stuff. So I think it would be a really good recommendation for someone who wants something like really deep into fantasy and wants something sort of violent. While Children, Blood and Bone is YA, it honestly, in my opinion, could border a long adult just because of the content, despite that the characters are younger. And I think it would be a really good one to pull people into the fantasy genre. I recommended this to a friend of mine who has not read hardly any fantasy, and she ended up really loving this book, and she surprised even herself with how much she loved it. So I think this is a good recommendation for people to get into the fantasy genre. The next recommendation isn't my all-time favorite book, but I do think it is a really good one to get people into reading, and that is Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. This one, if you have someone who likes video games or classic movies or like sort of pop culture stuff, it's a really interesting pull to pull people into this book because of all those references. I think Ready Player One is a really good recommendation for people just to get pulled into reading and find happiness in stuff that they already like in a new format. So last one, which is convenient because my camera is about to die, but the last recommendation I have on here is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. And I recommend this one because I think it can be recommended to almost any age, probably like 13 and over, I'd say. And I recommend this one because it is a contemporary, which I think is usually easier for people to get into if they are not into reading. And The Hate You Give, I think, is so important because of its message. I mean, obviously, it has such an important message behind it with like the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality, and the way that it delivers that message is in such a unique way. It's just so honest, and I think anyone off the street could enjoy this book and appreciate the content matter for what it really means in the greater context of the world. And I think this one is one that any teenager could pick up and enjoy and really learn something from, which I think is why I think it's such an important one to recommend. And I think it actually has pulled so many kids into enjoying to read already, and that's why it's still one that I recommend to friends and to customers at the bookstores I've worked at. Overall, it is a really incredible book, and I think lots of people really enjoy it, and there is a really incredible movie based on it as well. So that is a great point for people to read it and then watch it. So those are 10 books that I think are good recommendations to get people into reading. I honestly don't know what kind of books pulled me into reading, because I have been a pretty avid reader since I was in like the second grade. But there are big series that stand out to me that pulled me into certain genres, like Harry Potter and Percy Jackson were really big ones, and the Inkheart series when I was in like 5th grade, that was a big one that pulled me into reading. And then Twilight, of course, and the Hunger Games, and like those sorts of series pulled me into really loving like the reading community. And I think these other ones are really good jumping off points to, you know, get into it. Even if you're not reading 100 books a year, that doesn't matter. Read 5 books a year, 10, 20, do anything. Read 1 book a year. It's something. And I think all of these are good options to get into that. So I hope you enjoyed my recommendations. If you happen to pick any up or recommend any of these to someone you know, that'd be really awesome. But thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, and all that other fun stuff. I upload every Sunday, every other Sunday being reading vlogs, other Sundays being videos like this. So I hope you enjoy, and I hope you come back, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.